Bem-vindos ao Conexão BlackRock. Meu nome é Cindy Shimoide, sou diretora de consultoria de portfólios para a América Latina. Nos próximos episódios, eu vou entrevistar especialistas da BlackRock sobre diferentes mercados ou temas que podem ser relevantes para o investidor brasileiro. Eu vou trazer para vocês um pouco mais do conteúdo que a BlackRock gera globalmente. Se quiser saber mais sobre a BlackRock, aponte o celular para o QR Code que está aparecendo na sua tela ou confira a descrição do episódio. No episódio de hoje, temos o prazer de receber o Benjamin Souza, que é o nosso estrategista de investimentos para a América Latina. E vai ser o nosso convidado especial no episódio de hoje. Juntos, vamos trazer uma visão mais abrangente sobre a renda fixa americana e a importância dos BDRs de ETFs de renda fixa, que vai ser uma maneira para os brasileiros acessarem os benefícios desse mercado. Hi, Benjamin.
Hi. So my name is Benjamin Souza. I am the investment strategist for Latin America for BlackRock. And my role is simply look at the markets, understand the markets, and try to recommend investors what would I do if I were in their shoes. So that's the understanding if there's valuation, if there's interesting stories that are developing, and just recommend investors what would I do if I were in their shoes.
Great, thank you. And Benha, how does fixed income work in the United States? And how does the American economy impact the performance of fixed income investments in general?
So we have to think about, this is the largest market in the world. This is a market that has one issuer that no other market has, right? So think about the equity markets and you think of all these companies, you have Apple, Microsoft, like all these companies that issue in the equity market. No government issue like shares of Brazil or the US, right? So they have a much larger issuer, which is the government, right? And that basically is the global fixed income market is approximately $150 trillion. The global equity markets are a little over $100 trillion. So it's a significantly larger market, and that's why it's important now. There's a lot of pieces of the global bond market. So the most important one is obviously, as I was mentioning, global governments issuing bonds in either their own currency or in dollars or euro. Second, you have to think about corporates. So this same Apple and Microsoft, they issue debt as well. So that's part of the market. You have other, a little bit more niche markets. You have mortgages, you have floating securities, you have loans, you have a bunch of other pieces of the market, but between bonds from governments and from corporates, you have a significant portion of the market. Now, why is it important to other markets? You have to think about this. The fixed income market, in theory, all the variables are set, right? You have a specific date of maturity of your instrument. You have a specific set fixed coupon of your instrument, right? And ultimately, you have a discount rate that's gonna change or impact the valuation of that instrument. Now, it's important when the US government is setting policy rate because that impacts everything, but at the end of the day, this is a relative value game. If you can receive yields of 5% in the US, that's going to change your perception of why should I go to emerging markets or why should I go to developed markets that are paying significantly less than that. No? Same thing, think about Brazil for a minute. No? Brazil has significantly more yield than the US. Now, that's why it's very hard for Brazilians to go and invest abroad, because they're thinking, well, if I own a government security, maybe that's better, right? So it impacts in many ways. But the most important thing that we have to think about fixed income markets is that these are a relative value game. Now, people have to take the opportunity cost of not being in one opportunity versus the other, and being the US the largest portion of that global bond market, it has a significant amount of influence across every other bond market in the world.
Excellent. And given the influence of the U.S. markets, when we think about the environment today, could you share with us what do you think are the current trends in the fixed income markets in the United States?
So I think I will put two pieces that are relevant. Now, the first piece is and both are connected. It's about normalization of the market. We went through a period in 2020 that distorted a bunch of markets, right? Like the rates went to zero, the Fed started buying securities that flattened the curves, like a lot of things got distorted. And then eventually, all that intervention actually helped the economy recover. And more or less, we're seeing the normalization of many markets now. There's two things that are important in this normalization process. One is income. Fixed income, when yields were zero, the returns were not coming from income. We're coming from duration, we're coming from convexity, we're coming from roll down, we're coming from different pieces, but not necessarily the carry. 2022 was such a bad year for fixed income because of that. There was no coupon, there was no cushion, right, to buffer a little bit the impact of higher rates. Now, today, right, the yields in the US, you can get 5, 6, 7%, depending on which part of the US bond market you can get. But basically, the carry or the income is the bulk of the return. Now, that is new relatively to 2020 and relatively even before that, because we've had a long period of time after 2008 in which we didn't have any yield, we didn't have any income, right, to basically grab from returns from there. Now, the second piece, which is also connected to this, is the divergence of monetary policy. Every central bank in the world in March 2020 decided to cut rates. Every single one, like Brazil cut rates, the Fed cut rates, Bank of England, ECB, everybody cut rates. Now, eventually, the economy actually survived the COVID crisis, and they all, when growth came back, inflation came back, so everybody was hiking rates, and everybody was hiking rates at the same time. Brazil started earlier, was one of the pioneers of hiking rates, but everybody went in the same direction, right? And then after the inflation was under control, everybody controlled. But what we're seeing right now is divergence of monetary policy, which is interesting because, again, when we're thinking about this idea of relative value, right? When you look at Switzerland, and you have negative rates, something that happened back in 2020, it's back again now because they don't want inflows. Everybody's trying to buy Swiss bonds and they don't want that, right? So they're trying to scare investors away. You look at Europe, Europe is paying half of what the US is paying, right? And they're cutting aggressively. And you look at the Fed, and the Fed is saying, I am not certain that I should cut right now, right? They are saying that they are pausing, right? They're in the middle of a cutting cycle, but they are pausing because they're not sure that they can cut, and they're not sure how much they can cut, right? So this divergence plays a significant role, particularly around this idea of relative value in the fixed income market.
So as you were talking about the current environment, recently we've seen very important news relevant to the market around the downgrade of U.S. government bonds. How would you say that impacts our view on the markets, and how relevant that information is to the global investor?
Yeah, so investment grade ratings or credit ratings in general give a sense of the ability of a company or a government to pay back their debt. That's what they're trying to say. So when they tell you it's a AAA rating, that means that it's very, very, very unlikely to not service their debt. When you have something like in the BB or lower, you have higher probabilities of that. So that's the idea, and that's why people pay attention to it. At the end of the day, there's a line that matters, which is what cuts investment grade versus high yield, because there's certain investors that cannot invest in one or the other, and that's why it matters. Being a AAA or being a AA pretty much is the safest of, like, either the top or the second best option, right? So it doesn't really matter, but it's an indication from credit rating agencies that having a consistent deficit matters. Having a consistent deficit that is in the 5 to 6%, it's an issue for them, right? And they are telling you that. But it's also about institutions. And we've seen this over and over for the last few years, is that you have a sovereign debt ceiling, right? which once you get there, you can no longer issue debt, and you have a deficit and you need to fund that deficit, then basically freezes the checkbook from the Treasury, right? So that's why credit rating agency care about like not being a AAA and being a AA plus. Now, at the end of the day, what it means is not that the U.S. can or cannot pay their debt, but there's an instance in which sometimes the checkbook of the Treasury might get frozen, and that could be an issue. Now, the Treasury will always have the ability to prioritize payments. So what they've done in the past, whenever they reach the sovereign ceiling, is that they start furloughing employees, they shut down the postmaster, they shut down parks, they shut down other things. They've never, ever in the history of the U.S. have actually stopped paying their debts. So that's why it's still, even with all these concerns, they're still a very high-rated issuer at the end of the day.
What would you say are the differences that we can highlight between investing directly in U.S. fixed income bonds or investing through fixed income ETF BDRs? What could be the highlights of fixed income ETF BDRs for Brazilian investors?
Yeah, you have to think about this. It's an issue of access. It's a lot easier, right, to in your own local account with your own local currency in your own market, just buy now basically any piece of the global market. You can buy U.S. equities, you can buy U.S. bonds, you can buy global bonds or global equities through BDRs, right? So this is an issue that is solving, right, the issue of access, right? You needed to have an external account, you needed to have access to dollars, you need to have all these things, and suddenly now the BDRs have the ability to access this piece of the market from your market, right? So this is important. This is something that we have seen in pretty much all of Latin America. The idea of through your local market, in your local currency, local settlement, buying international either fixed income or equities, that's important. Why? Because it helps diversification. It helps diversification in a very simple way, right? Through your local account, you can suddenly start thinking about the idea of diversification.
So you talked about diversification. So let's move to portfolio construction, which personally is a passion of mine. So how would you say that investors can diversify their portfolios using U.S. fixed income assets?
Yeah, so you have to think about these factors of return that are differentiated, right? They will provide, if something looks and feels like your portfolio is not giving you that benefit of diversification. So the first thing to start is that when you are a Brazilian investor, right, and you look at the performance of the real was in a very different place a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 10 years ago, right? So the idea that when things got really bad, and we've had many episodes of when that happened, the first thing that happened is that the dollar rallies against the real, right? So the idea that you have a local asset, a local Brazilian asset in reais, and it's coming down because there's risk aversion, there's an issue, fiscal consolidation, there's a lot of issues that we can point to, but the first thing that happens is that the BRL takes the hit, right? So what's going to happen is that if you have anything denominated in a different currency, right, particularly a hard currency like the dollar or the euro, typically that helps you like soften the impact of what's happening in Brazilian equities or Brazilian fixed income, right? So this is the simple concept of diversification, that you start from the dollar, and then from there you can think about of what other factors can I add to help diversification. When the BCB is cutting rates, and again, as we were talking about this diversification, the BCB is hiking right now, while the US is not doing anything, and while Europe, for instance, is cutting rates, right? So you have this idea that there's an additional factor that's going to behave differently than your local fixed income. So when you are accessing something that's giving you access to dollars, but also you are accessing something that might benefit when the Fed finally starts cutting rates, right? Like that's giving you an additional factor of diversification. Now, think about like all these other factors that play a role. Corporate spreads, U.S. corporate spread have to do with what's going on with the U.S., what's happening in the country, what's happening with their companies, what's happening with their ability to pay back their debt, right? That will provide you a bigger or smaller premium, right? Which has absolutely nothing to do with what's happening in Brazil, right? So all these different pieces play an important role in diversifying a Brazilian portfolio.
Excellent. And when I think about the future and all the talks about artificial intelligence, so let's change a little bit the route of the conversation here. How do you think that advancements in technology and artificial intelligence, the AI, may impact fixed income investing in the coming years?
So it's very interesting. Again, this is the current trend in artificial intelligence is language models, LLMs. But in reality, we've been doing machine learning for a while, right? And think about the complex set of problems that you have in the fixed income world, right? When you're looking at the equity market, you have one issuer, right? So you have Apple, that's it. It's one stock of Apple, right? And then how that behaves inside a portfolio, right? And that's what you have to model. When you're looking at how many bonds Apple has, right? It's dozens of bonds that they have, right? So they have different characteristics, but they're all Apple, right? So when you have to think about the size of the portfolios in the equity market, you can count it in the hundreds, maybe 1,000, maybe, right? But when you're looking at portfolios in fixed income world, you are thousands and thousands and thousands of securities, right? So it's a lot more complex one versus the other. Now, when you're looking at ETFs or BDRs, in this case, generally what these are doing is I am trying to replicate an index, a benchmark, and I'm trying to do all these different things without and taking into account the cost of transaction. So it's a really complex process that we have been doing, because it's one thing to get one or two orders of creating new shares of BDRs or ETFs, but the other thing is that when these are very, very large portfolios and they have hundreds of redeem and create orders, right? It's humanly impossible, right, to actually do this process manually, right? So we've been improving significantly the process through machine learning, right? Trying to understand the factors, trying to understand how factors interact with each other, and trying to just make portfolios faster and easier and more efficiently, right? So we have been pioneers in the use of machine learning for the last 15 years. And we keep improving because just the size of this pocket of liquidity in the ETFs just keeps growing, and every year is growing faster. So it's there's a lot more interaction. Again, think about the fixed income, like go back a step. But the fixed income market is still an over-the-counter market, right? That means that somebody is picking up a phone, right? Somebody on the other side is picking up a phone, still very manual. Equity markets are electronic, are completely electronic. Everything is sent to an order, everything is sorted, like highest, lower price, and that's why there's only one price. Fixed income markets still have like two prices because they still are over the counter. But the more and more investors are accessing it, and the more and more are using products that actually set and trade electronically, right? You have to bring all the technology from the equity markets into the fixed income world, and that's what we've been seeing over the last 10, 15 years.
Well, thank you once again, Benja, for your participation. It's a pleasure having you with us.
No, thanks for the invite. It's always a great pleasure for me to connect with the Brazilian audience, and thanks for the invitation.
Bom, pessoal, resumindo aqui, nós sabemos que o mercado de títulos dos Estados Unidos é o maior e mais líquido do mundo. Como o Benjamin descreveu, ele é tão grande que determina a direção geral de muitos outros mercados de títulos de renda fixa. Então, ele acaba sendo uma ferramenta crucial para os investidores globalmente. E o interessante é que hoje esse mercado pode ser facilmente acessado por investidores brasileiros via BDRs de ETFs, nas suas contas locais, em reais. E por último, no episódio de hoje, outra conclusão que a gente pode tirar aqui é que todas essas partes do mercado de títulos de renda fixa dos Estados Unidos podem ajudar os investidores no Brasil a acessar vários componentes de retorno, Então, por exemplo, a exposição ao dólar, duração internacional ou duration, como a gente fala, crédito, tanto prêmios de grau de investimento quanto high yield, inflação, hipotecas, entre outros. Último recado, agora você encontra a Conexão BlackRock também nas principais plataformas de podcasts. Saiba mais na descrição. Obrigada a todos e até a próxima!